I've always been crazy about road trips, that feeling of freedom on the open road with no real destination in mind. In January 2024, I decided to take a long drive through the countryside, trying to escape the stressful city routine. It was the middle of the night, and as the city lights faded away, the dark, quiet landscape took over. The radio was off, and I could just hear my thoughts blending with the constant hum of the engine. The solitude of the road usually calms me, but that night, something weird started creeping in. After hours on the road, I spotted a faint light in the distance and decided to pull over. I ended up at this old gas station, looking pretty much abandoned, though there was a rusty sign still flickering with dim lights. The place seemed like it had been forgotten by time, surrounded by fields of weeds and tall trees blocking any view of what was beyond. I filled up the tank and decided to stretch my legs before hitting the road again. As I walked up to the convenience store, two attendants greeted me with overly warm smiles, which made me feel a bit uneasy. I chatted briefly with them. They were wearing old uniforms with gold buttons that sparkled oddly in the weak light. They seemed way too interested in my trip, asking where I was coming from and where I was heading. But whenever I tried to ask more about the area, they'd quickly change the subject. There was something unsettling in their eyes, like they were hiding something. One of the attendants, a woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, offered me a coffee that smelled sweet and artificial. I hesitated, but her politeness made me accept. I decided to take a walk around the station before getting back on the road. The gas pumps were old, with analog dials that didn't seem to work right, and the convenience store was nearly empty, except for some dusty shelves and products that had expired years ago. As I walked around, I started to feel more and more uneasy, like I was being watched. It was time to leave and get back on the road. I quickly topped off the tank, thanked the attendants again, and waved goodbye, feeling a chill run down my spine as I left. Back on the road, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. The darkness seemed thicker, and the trees around me cast long, distorted shadows over the road. I drove for a few more hours, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts about the gas station. The full moon barely lit up the road, casting a shadowy game of light and dark that added to my confusion. When I finally started to relax, I realized I'd left my wallet at the gas station. My heart skipped a beat. There was no cash to refill, and my ID was still inside. Without thinking twice, I turned the car around, determined to get back what I'd forgotten. The road seemed endless as I drove back, with each mile making my anxiety worse. When I finally saw the faint light of the gas station in the distance, I felt an immediate sense of relief. But as I got closer, something was terribly wrong. The gas station was completely gone. In its place was just an abandoned lot, overgrown with tall weeds and rubble that looked like it had been there for decades. My heart raced, and panic started to set in. I looked around, trying to find any trace of the attendants or anything that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Just silence, and the wind whispering through the leaves. My instincts were telling me not to believe what I was seeing, but the reality before my eyes was undeniable. The area where the gas station had been now looked like it had been swallowed by nature a long time ago. Plants grew wildly, wrapping around concrete and metal structures, and broken pieces of wood were scattered across the ground. I decided to explore a bit further, walking toward where the convenience store had been. With every step, small clumps of dirt and dry leaves lifted into the air, and the silence around me was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of the wind. As I moved forward, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I looked around, trying to find the source of my unease, but all I could see were dancing shadows cast by the twisted trees. Suddenly, I spotted a figure in the distance, something moving slowly among the wreckage. My heart raced, and a mix of fear and curiosity pushed me to get closer. As I neared, the figure became clearer. It was one of the attendants, or at least someone who looked a lot like him, dressed in the same old uniform. When he saw me, there was no recognition, just a blank, lifeless stare that froze me in my tracks. The figure standing there in front of me didn't react when I approached. His empty eyes seemed to pierce the darkness around us, and a cold feeling overtook my body. I tried calling his name, but my voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. He didn't respond, just stood there like a statue forgotten by time. I decided to step back, but something was stopping me from moving. It was as if an invisible force was holding me in place, making my anxiety and fear grow. My mind started playing tricks on me, imagining all the possible explanations for what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure began to fade slowly, as if it were being absorbed by the darkness around it. My heart was pounding uncontrollably as I watched each second of this surreal transformation. When the figure finally vanished, an even deeper silence took over the place, almost tangible. I realized I needed to get out of there as fast as possible, but the road seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a narrow, unfamiliar trail winding through the thick woods. With no other choice, I started following the trail, each step pulling me further away from what I knew and closer to a mystery that seemed endless. The narrow trail wound through the dense woods. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a green, humid labyrinth. The tall trees blocked much of the moonlight, creating intricate patterns of shadows that danced in the wind. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. My senses were on high alert. Every sound, the crackling of branches, the rustling of leaves, made my heart skip a beat. I tried to rationalize what was happening, but logic seemed to slip away from me with each passing moment. As I moved on, I noticed the trail was getting even narrower, almost invisible under the thick vegetation. That's when I heard a distant sound, something that resembled whispers, like voices talking between the trees. My curiosity overcame my initial fear, and I started moving toward where the sound was coming from. As I got closer, the voices grew clearer, but still incomprehensible. I reached a small clearing where the moonlight could break through, revealing a circle of old stones in the center. In the middle of the circle was an old wooden bench, worn down by time, and around me, mysterious symbols were carved into the stones, forming patterns I couldn't decipher. As I approached the circle of stones, the whispers grew louder, forming a cacophony that was almost incomprehensible. The air seemed to vibrate with an ancient, unknown energy, making my nerves tingle, anticipating something beyond explanation. I sat down on the old wooden bench, feeling the cold of the night seep into my bones, while I tried to make sense of the symbols carved into the stones around me. Each symbol seemed to tell a forgotten story, a lost language from the past that my mind struggled to understand. Suddenly, the stones began to glow with a faint, bluish light, and a thin mist started rising from the ground, wrapping around me in its cold embrace. My heart was racing as the mist enveloped me, obscuring my vision and intensifying the feeling of isolation. A soft yet powerful voice echoed around me, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. But somehow it resonated deep inside me. I felt a presence beyond comprehension, as if I were witnessing something that transcended reality. The lights on the stones pulsed in sync with the voice, creating hypnotic patterns that made me lose track of time and space. Desperate to understand what was happening, I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the feelings that were emerging, a mix of deep fear and a strange sense of belonging to something greater. Suddenly, I opened my eyes, and the mist had vanished, leaving behind only the absolute silence of the clearing. The ancient stones still glowed faintly, now with a softer intensity, but the sense that something had shifted inside me remained. I slowly stood up, feeling a strange energy pulsing through my veins, as if I had been marked by that encounter. I looked around, trying to find any sign of the attendants or the gas station, but all that was left was nature reclaiming its place. That's when I noticed a glowing path emerging between the trees, leading out of the clearing. Without fully understanding why, I felt an irresistible pull guiding me toward that light, as if it were the only way out of that enigmatic place. As I followed the glowing path, the feeling of being watched returned. But this time it was less threatening and more curious. The trees around me seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and the soft light illuminated my way in an almost magical way. With each step, I got closer to the clearing again, but now with a different perception of the environment. When I reached the edge of the path, I looked back and saw the circle of stones slowly disappear, as if it had never existed. The main road was back, perfectly untouched, and the starlight reflected off the asphalt. My heart was still racing, but a feeling of relief and mystery enveloped me. I grabbed my wallet, wondering if it had all just been a strange dream. But the vivid memory of that night made me question the reality of what had happened. As I drove down the restored road, my mind still buzzing with the images and sensations from the clearing, I decided I needed to leave that experience behind and focus on continuing my journey. But something inside me had changed irrevocably. The road seemed quieter now, as if the chaos of that night had been absorbed by the darkness around me. Yet, a small unease remained, a sense that I wasn't completely free from what I had witnessed. I looked at the wallet in my hands, still intact, and a part of me hoped that at least this would be proof that it had all been a hallucination caused by exhaustion and solitude. I reached my final destination the next day, exhausted and mentally shaken. I shared the story with a few close friends who listened with skepticism, chalking it all up to a vivid imagination during the trip. Still, the doubt lingered in my mind. To this day, I avoid returning to those isolated roads, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about that disappeared gas station and wonder if I truly lived through it, or if it was something beyond human understanding. Regardless of the truth, that experience taught me to respect the mysteries life can present and to value even more the tangible reality that surrounds us.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I'm Steve, a 32-year-old graphic designer who's always dreamed of having my own space. In the summer of 2024, I finally decided to take the plunge and bought an old townhouse. I was excited about the idea of renovating it and turning it into my creative haven. At that time, my life was pretty calm. Stable job, a few close friends, and a routine that, even though it was kind of boring, worked for me. During my first month in the new place, I started noticing little mysteries that I initially overlooked. One afternoon while I was renovating, peeling wallpaper off the hallway, I spotted a door that didn't seem like it belonged there. It was hidden behind several layers of wallpaper, almost camouflaged by the faded paint. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. I'd never seen that door before, and strangely enough, I was sure I'd never been in that spot. As I read those words, a sense of unease started to creep in. I decided to dig deeper, slowly walking through the basement, looking for something that could explain those strange writings. My footsteps echoed off the silent walls, and every sound seemed to heighten the eerie atmosphere of that abandoned place. Suddenly, my eyes fell on a dark corner where a small wooden table was pressed against the wall. On it, there was an old notebook, its pages yellowed and worn with time. With trembling hands, I picked up the notebook and carefully flipped through its pages. To my surprise, they were all filled with notes that, once again, looked like my own handwriting. Stories, thoughts, and even drawings I didn't remember making. Each page seemed to reveal fragments of a lost memory, connecting my present life to this mysterious basement. Doubt and fear started to mix inside me. How did that notebook end up there? And why, when I'd never been in that space before, did I write all of this? My heart raced as I tried to process what I was reading. Every word in the notebook seemed like a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. I couldn't remember writing any of it, and the thought that someone or something had access to my innermost thoughts unsettled me. I decided to take the notebook to my room, hoping to find a logical explanation for this strange coincidence. The night fell quickly, and with it came a heavy silence that made the place even more oppressive. Lying in bed, I flipped and reflipped the pages of the notebook, trying to find a clue about where these writings came from. That's when I noticed some entries mentioned events from my life that hadn't happened yet. My skin went cold as I read about decisions I would make in the coming months, encounters with people I hadn't met yet, and even small details of my daily life that I never would have imagined could be predicted. The feeling of being watched and manipulated began to intensify, and a chilling doubt took over. Could the house somehow be influencing my fate? The next morning, I barely slept, tormented by the words in the notebook. I decided I needed to learn more about the history of this house and how my writings were connected to it. I started by researching old municipal records and archives at the local library. What I found was disturbing. The townhouse I was living in had been the site of tragic events over a century ago, including unexplained disappearances and reports of supernatural phenomena. One story told of a man who, just like me, had found a notebook with his own notes, but he disappeared without a trace shortly after. Motivated by the need for answers, I went back to the basement with the notebook in hand. The atmosphere felt even heavier than before, and the weak light from my flashlights cast dancing shadows on the walls. While I explored the empty space, I found a small window covered in cobwebs, offering a glimpse of the abandoned garden outside. That's when I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, there were marks on the floor that resembled the lines of a pentagram, drawn with what looked like dried blood. My heart almost stopped when I realized that some of the words in the notebook referred to ancient rituals and dark pacts. The feeling that something sinister was lurking became even more real, and a wave of fear overtook me, wondering if I was destined to repeat the tragic history of this place. After discovering those marks on the floor, a sense of urgency gripped me. I needed to get out of that basement, but something made me hesitate. It was like an invisible force was holding me there, a morbid curiosity I couldn't ignore. I decided to take pictures of the place and the marks on the floor as a way of documenting what was happening. When I lifted my phone to capture the scene, the camera focused on something I hadn't noticed before: a shadow in the opposite corner from the marks. But it wasn't just any shadow, it seemed to move, to breathe, as if it were alive. My body froze, and the silence was broken by a low sound, an almost imperceptible whisper coming from the direction of the shadow. The voice seemed to call my name, but in a distorted way, as if someone was trying to imitate it. Terrified, I ran for the stairs and climbed as fast as I could, leaving the basement door open behind me. When I reached the living room, my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped my phone. Looking at the screen, I saw that in one of the photos, the shadow had a more defined shape. It was humanoid, but with strange proportions, like something trying to look like a person, but failing. After that experience in the basement, I didn't go down there again for days. But things in the house started changing in ways that were impossible to ignore. Objects moved around, doors I knew I had locked appeared open, and at night I heard footsteps coming from downstairs. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was constant, as if the entire house was alive and aware of my presence. One night, while working on my computer, the lights flickered, and the notebook fell from the shelf by itself. The sound echoed through the room, and when I looked at the floor, I saw that a new page had appeared. That page hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. At the top, there was a date, the next day. The words written were jumbled, like a hurried warning, but one thing was clear to me. It mentioned the basement again. Go down before they come for you. Panic took over me. Who were they? And why did the notebook seem to know more about the house than I did? I spent the rest of the night awake, unable to sleep, trying to decide if I should follow the warning or just leave forever. But deep down, I knew that somehow I was trapped in this place, like there was something that needed to be resolved before I could break free from it. The next morning, filled with a mix of desperation and curiosity, I decided to follow the notebook's warning. I grabbed a flashlight, a kitchen knife, and with my heart racing, I descended the basement stairs. The atmosphere felt different, heavier, and the air seemed to vibrate with an energy I couldn't explain. When I got downstairs, I noticed that the marks on the floor were clearer, as if they had been reinforced recently. In the center of the pentagram, there was something new, a small mirror with a golden frame covered by a black cloth. Hesitant, I approached and pulled the cloth off. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw something that didn't make sense. It was me, but I wasn't in the basement. It looked like I was in another place, surrounded by shadows that moved slowly around me. My reflection started to smile, but I wasn't smiling. That's when it spoke, in my voice, but deep and distorted. You shouldn't be here. There's no turning back now. The mirror began to vibrate, and a cold wind swept through the basement, snuffing out my flashlight. Everything went dark, except for the faint glow from the mirror, which seemed to pull me in. The darkness in the basement felt heavy, almost like I was submerged in water. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground, unable to move. The mirror kept emitting that strange glow, and my reflected image wouldn't stop staring at me, now with a smile that looked more and more twisted. I began to whisper to myself, almost like a mantra. This isn't real. This isn't real. Trying to bring my mind back to reason. That's when I felt something cold touch my shoulder. The reflection in the mirror didn't just smile, it waved at me. Not with a hand, but with something in the background, like a shadow that grew and moved beyond the frame. My heart raced, and finally I managed to move. I ran for the stairs, tripping on something along the way, but I didn't look back. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door so hard that the whole house seemed to shake. I locked the door and shoved a bookshelf against it, feeling my whole body tremble. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, while I heard a muffled sound coming from below. It was a laugh, or at least something that sounded like a laugh, but it wasn't mine. After that night, something changed in me. It seemed like the house didn't want me to leave, but I was determined to go. The next day, I spent packing my things, trying to ignore the strange sounds still coming from the basement, like scratching or soft footsteps. I called a friend and asked for help to move out as quickly as possible. When he arrived, he avoided asking about my state, but I think my pale face and hollow eyes said it all. As we carried the boxes to the car, I felt like the entire house was watching me, every wall and every shadow, as if waiting for something. The moment I put the last box in the car, I looked at the basement door one last time. Something inside me knew I would never fully understand what had happened there. Before leaving, I left the notebook on the living room table, open to the last page, where I wrote, "Don't come back." I don't know why I did that, but it felt right, like a warning for whoever came after me. Since I left that house, I've never had the courage to research it or its past. But to this day, sometimes I feel like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to find me again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.